and rotary wing aircraft, jets, bombers and helicopters to you and me. The U.S. has signaled it wouldn't be possible without first destroying Gaddafi's air defense system, including missiles and radar installations. Well, the U.S. could then use its AWACS surveillance planes to monitor the no-fly zone, but mistakes can be made. In 1994, the Americans shot down 2 of their own Black Hawk helicopters in Iraq. It's thought around 100 fighter jets would be needed to enforce a no-fly zone. The U.S. could put them on the aircraft carrier it's sending near Libya, or perhaps at its bases in Sicily and Crete. Lawrence Lee looks now at the full range of the international community's options and its worries.
If the uprising began because of the death of fear, it's the fear of death that's now holding it back. The opposition fighters have said repeatedly that they're not as worried by Gaddafi's foot soldiers as they are by his jets and helicopters. All the same, though, the fact that Gaddafi's forces have now retaken the town of AlJazeera shows that on the ground too, over time, the regime has the capacity to wear resistance down. It all presents a major problem for the international community. Most of the world may have decided that Gaddafi's time is up, but the longer this goes on, the more entrenched he's becoming. Hence the increasingly urgent calls for military intervention.
We've got NATO, as we speak, consulting in Brussels around a wide range of potential options, including potential military options, in response to the violence that continues to take place inside of Libya.
Option 1, no-fly zones. If the US and others are worried about the logistics and how they might do it, it's also worth remembering that no-fly zones worked only partly in Iraq and quite ineffectively in the Balkans, where Slobodan Milosevic's army was still able to mount effective artillery attacks on civilians. Option 2, arming the uprising and presumably training them as well, since many of them don't have much idea about how to use their new weapons. While in many ways it's much less complicated than no-fly zones, it's obvious that the concern in places like Washington is where all those weapons might end up.
Many of the al-Qaeda activists in Afghanistan and later in Iraq came from Libya and came from eastern Libya, which is now the so-called free area of Libya. So, I mean, there's a lot of moving parts to this.
In the end, the good news for organisations like NATO or powers like the US is that for once there's little debate as to whether they're doing the right thing by offering to get involved. Unfortunately, the longer it takes for them to decide what to do, the more entrenched Gaddafi's becoming. Lawrence Lee, Al Jazeera.
Okay, well, let's talk more about all the latest developments in Libya with Tariq Youssef. He's from Benghazi and is Dean of the Dubai School of Government. Tariq, thank you for talking to us here on Al Jazeera. So we now know that there's been a contact between an envoy to Muammar Gaddafi as well as the Opposition National Council. There's some talk of negotiating a possible exit strategy for him. Do you think that the Opposition National Council should agree to this at this point in time?
If it ends the violence and it hastens the departure of Gaddafi and his children, I think there's a lot of merit to them agreeing to this, even if people on the ground may not necessarily subscribe to it. A lot of people want to see Gaddafi held accountable. They want the regime, including him and his children, to be brought to justice. But in the interest of ending the violence and keeping the country unified and avoiding any prospect of civil war, however limited that might be, I think the National Libyan Opposition Council should be considering this seriously, but it should also think of its domestic constituency within the opposition and package this and produce it in such a way that the public is also behind it.
Well, we must stress that there are also conditions and those conditions are that the UN allows Muammar Gaddafi to keep his money and avoid prosecution.
This complicates the matter because it requires that the UN Security Council, which issued the resolution just a few days ago, to agree to it. And it's not clear that that discussion will take place for a long time to come. So there could be a bilateral deal between the Libyan National Council and Gaddafi, but they'll have to sell it and get international legitimacy for it. And it's not clear that at that point, people may not want to still prosecute Gaddafi and bring him to justice. After all, the case of Libya and the atrocities committed recently could possibly be referred to the ICC.
Well, yes, I was going to ask you, where is the ICC's role in all of this? if Muammar Gaddafi walks away from Libya, he can't simply walk away from some of the actions that he's accused of committing.
That's right. So he could walk away possibly from being held accountable by the future Libyan government, but the ICC could still bring him to justice, possibly, because the Libyan government or the future Libyan government may not have enough statutes and may not be able to enforce its own will on the ICC and the will of the International Security Council. So I think the more details there is in the deal, the more complicated it gets. I think the basis of the deal, and one that Gaddafi should find attractive, is his safe exit, him along with his children, and that will end the violence, and that will be acceptable at this point to most sides, including the international community.
What about taking a look at events on the ground? Do you think that rebels are now losing momentum with Gaddafi forces recapturing certain towns?
The town of Bin Jawad is important, it's significant because it was captured a few days ago by the rebels, but it doesn't have any strategic importance, unless, of course, we only focus on the fact that it lies between the east and the forces from the east marching on Sirte. It's only 200 kilometers away. Tactically, to lose it will not change the facts on the ground. But if the rebels intend to reach Sirte, then they'll have to recapture Bin Jawad. I think the facts of the ground, as we saw them a few days ago, remain essentially the same. Big victories have not been achieved by any side, and we're kind of entering a period of a stalemate. And that might be in the interest of lessening the violence and the bloodshed, although we should also note that time is not on the side of the cities that are surrounded in the west, Misrata, Zawiya, because their continued strangulation, both militarily and food supplies, medical supplies, could weaken the resolve of the residents inside, especially in the absence of direct logistical contacts between the Libyan National Council and the cities that lie further west of Tripoli.
All right, Tariq Youssef, thank you very much for that. In other news, and in Kuwait, youth groups there are calling for protests on Tuesday. As with previous demonstrations, they want the Prime Minister to step down and greater freedoms nationwide. The Al Sabah family has ruled the small Gulf state for more than 250 years, and political parties are banned. Tunisia's interim prime minister has unveiled a new cabinet, the third since the overthrow of President Ben Ali in January. He's also disbanded the country's feared and hated secret police. More from Nazanin Mushiri in Tunis.
It was billed as a new beginning, but the interim prime minister Beji Caid Sebsi admitted the key positions in government will remain the same. The difference now, a promise that not one member of the cabinet will stand in the next election, and security will be a priority.
We wanted it to be a caretaker government, but more importantly, a government which saves the country from this predicament.
One of the first moves of this new government, the dismantling of the so-called political police, filmed here by AlJazeera. A force which harassed and spied on Tunisians for so many years. The Ministry of Interior announced